happy Jackson arrived in one piece, and just take a deep breath. So, good afternoon. My name is Sarah Riff. I'm the Outreach Coordinator and Undergrad Advisor for the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program, and I'm very pleased to have you here today for our Lunchtime Lecture series. If this is your first time coming to our series and you're interested in kind of finding out our whole schedule of events, we do have a weekly listserv that we send an email blast out to of all of our events, and there's a clipboard over there in the corner that you can put your email address on. And so I'll just get right down to it. We're happy to have Jackson Foote here today. He's a PhD candidate in the School of Journalism and Mass Comm at UW-Madison. He's also a former recipient of last season's Tinker-Name Summer Research Program, grant program, I should say. Today he's going to talk about Otro Chile Es Posible, media memory and framing political opportunity in the online networks of the Chilean student movement. So thanks for coming.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And thanks everyone for coming. Sorry that I'm running late. My introduction here is partially about an experience that I was able to have in Santiago during my month that I was there in the field, in which I was invited to see the premiere of a new Chilean film that had come out about the dictatorship. So this film, as you may know, because it was nominated for an Academy Award, starred Gael Garcia Bernal, and he came in, of course, about 10 minutes late, and everyone was waiting for him. So I got a little bit of that experience this afternoon. I didn't mean to recreate it, but thanks for letting me do that. I'm also going to keep this hopefully to about 30 minutes so that there's time for questions. There's a lot of expertise in this room, and so I hope that there will be tons of questions and feedback. This is a work in progress and one that I've talked with some of you about, but hope to get a lot of new kind of impressions on this type of stuff. So, I couldn't decide whether to include a question mark or not. Maybe that's one of the things that you guys can help me decide. I think the students that I worked with in Chile over the month and have continued to follow would emphatically say that it shouldn't have a question mark, that it's a declarative statement. Another Chile is possible. And I think it's an open question, and I'm looking at it kind of from three angles. From an angle of media, so how discourse and framing circulates within a new media context that includes online tools like Twitter and Facebook, which you'll see some of. Memory, both of the dictatorship or silence about the dictatorship, as well as the transition that began in 1990 and the post-transition or post-democratic presidencies of the Concertacion, the coalition that took over after Pinochet left power in 1990. So I'm looking also at how the students are kind of framing this political opportunity around that memory and that moment, and are contesting the current kind of notions about memory of that period. And of course, this is the Chilean student movement that I'm focused on, which began in 2011, but I'll give a bit more of a preview of that later, or review of that later. So I want to start with this moment that I kind of encountered in 2011 when I got, or 2012, sorry, when I got down there. So when I arrived in Chile in July, there had been a large mobilization in Santiago that had been, like many of them, even though it was authorized, repressed by the police using these guys, which some of you probably recognize. They're known as guanacos, which is an animal that's native to Chile, and they're called guanacos because they spit water a little more violently than the camelid version, or the kind of animal version of these. So the protest that I had arrived on the heels of drew tens of thousands of people, was repressed by the police, but got tons of media attention, just like the other protests that I had seen leading up to this moment in Chile. So leading up to the summer of 2012, had seen the largest mobilization since the dictatorship had ended in a country that, that had become known for this kind of elite political consensus making, or elite political formulas, as we'll talk about a little more later. This picture in particular was snapped by one of the student leaders and then posted around Twitter and Facebook. Giorgio Jackson, who, other than having my namesake, which is pretty cool as well, he was the leader of the Federation for the Universidad Católica, which is one of the two major public elite universities in Chile. And he was, for a year, about a year and a half, the leader of the, I would argue, second most important student federation in Chile. And these are not like student governments here in the United States, in the sense that they have traditionally, for the last century, especially at La Universidad Católica and La Universidad de Chile, had an important role and played an important role in the political sphere, right? So they've actually been a strong political actor, and I'll talk a little more later about how this particular federation is using communication tools to construct a strong counter-public that can interact with the government. So this picture, again, building up this context, snapped by Giorgio Jackson, was taken with a tool that many of you are probably familiar with, Instagram, kind of makes things look very old. So it adds yet another layer to this sort of context, right? He's taken a picture and made it look like it was taken potentially in the 1970s or the 1980s. Well, I guess in the 1980s, specifically around, if you wanted to kind of try to put this picture in a historical perspective, specifically around 1988, which is when the No campaign, the movie that I was referring to in the beginning, was launched and captured over 50% of the vote to dislodge Augusto Pinochet from his 17-year run as dictator in Chile. So this campaign, as we'll see in the following clip, was a fairly sophisticated, at least at the advertising level, PR and mass media campaign. And this sign here was throughout Chile in July and leading up to the beginning of August, as this movie was going to premiere in the capital. And so we'll look at this clip here, which many of you, maybe you've seen the trailers, or potentially you have seen the movie itself, although I don't know, since I saw it elsewhere, I don't know if it's come to Madison.
La persona que te haga un himno, yo quiero un jingle. Sin arte, sin folclore, sin pop, sin rock. Jingle. ¿Ustedes de verdad piensan que nos van a dejar salir al aire? Sí. Van a meter preso, eso es lo que va a pasar. Lo sabemos. ¿Cómo es? Todos sabemos. Lo importante es que estamos todos acá. Yo agradezco la valentía, muchos no se atrevieron. Miren, si este es el voto, y lo marcan, ¿qué quieran? No más. No más Pinocho. No más dictadura. Bueno, puede funcionar. Es muy bueno, es perfecto. No más censura, no más muerte. No más censura, no más abuso. Está muy bien. Sí. No más deuda, no más intereses, no más cuentas por pagar. Lo tuyo como va. Falta gente, falta tiempo, faltan los contenidos. Tenemos que rellenar 15 minutos todos los días durante un mes. Ellos rellenan todo el día, toda la vida. Sí, pero estamos a 3 semanas de salir al aire y no tenemos nada. Y 15 minutos no es mucho. No, pero hay que ponerse a trabajar porque... Uy, no, listo. Se acabó, se acabó. Me voy a la productora. ¿Va? Sí, viene, pero... ¿Qué tal, Lucho? Hola. Estamos por comenzar. Ya.
So that wasn't exactly the clip that I wanted to show. But what it does help to understand is there's this team in the movie, in the film that's featured, that's trying to come up with an effective advertising campaign for the No campaign. And essentially, the clip that I was going to show contrasts two ways of advertising about the No campaign. One is focused on brutality, it's focused on victims of human rights abuse, it's focused on the Guanacos, the dictatorship, and it's focused on the violent legacy of the dictatorship and leaving that behind. The other is focused primarily on what you kind of heard was the nascent sort of campaign that was coming about, looking towards the future and looking towards a Chile without Pinochet and a Chile that was hopeful and was bringing the joy. So this is kind of the choice that this campaign team makes to begin to advertise the possibility of a return to democracy. And I think this is important for three different reasons, or it's interesting to look at for three different reasons. So the first of which is that this actually becomes, for me, as I'm sitting there in a movie theater in Santiago watching this with an invited set of a couple hundred student activists who had been involved in the student movement for the last year and a half, it became an analogy about the tensions that I saw many of these student leaders go through when considering how they would communicate their goals to the broader public. So were they going to focus on the possibility of a bright future for education, or would they focus on the problematic nature of the legacy of the dictatorship and the transition? And this was a constant tension, which I'll talk about a little more later. One of the other reasons that I think this was interesting is because we'll look at some of the reactions to this. It problematizes the kind of way of thinking about the transition from the democracy, or from the dictatorship to democracy. So it kind of casts this narrative, rather that the students then problematized, about a sort of easy campaign to implement and show the Chilean public who is ready to receive this, what a new Chile, a hopeful Chile would be like. And the third way that it's important, the context that I really think is key here, and the great line that I think sums up the movie, is Gael Garcia Bernal is both introducing at the beginning of the movie, and then when he introduces the first campaign spot for the No campaign, he says, you have to understand this within the current social context. Now, the first time he says this, he's showing, if I recall correctly, a Pepsi commercial. And the second time he shows this, he's showing this campaign for the No. And as scholars and thinkers in Chile have alluded to, this is part of the privatization of social life, that has happened in Chile during the dictatorship, treating the citizen as consumer, as Stern and others point out. And this movie, I think this clip, which if you want to stick around, I'll pull it up. This clip really perfectly encapsulates this idea that now politics in a post-dictatorship Chile will be treating the citizen as a consumer of that political life. Other scholars who talk about social movements, talk specifically about communication, like Lance Bennett, also look at this in Western Europe as well as the United States, and talk about this as the personalization of politics, the kind of me-casting of politics in which the individual relationship to the state and individual liberty is more important than the social commitment and the community ties that bind people in a democracy. So this, you have to look at I think, what's going on in Chile now within the current social context, to paraphrase Gael Garcia Bernal. So this takes us a little bit then back to after this movie premiered, and we have this campaign going on in the streets. We have hundreds of students go and attend this movie and make comments in the news media about it, including some of the student leaders that I interviewed. We have a wide outpouring on Facebook about this movie in particular. And this gives you a sense, I think, of the type of world that, that exists on Facebook among activists, both groups. So this is a Facebook page that doesn't exist as an offline group, has no identity outside of the Facebook page, and is sharing information with a variety of people, including me. So this is after the No movie lost the Oscar nomination. So it was nominated for an Oscar, as you guys may know, back in January, and unfortunately it didn't win. So this author, this framer, says the No lost. We continue in dictatorship paradigms, pure truth. And then the next person who is posting that I have in my feed, who's an actual student, says, I hope that is saying to her brother, right? So this quote here is a member of the Communist Party, or the Communist Youth, who goes to La Universidad de Chile. And she's commenting to her brother, I hope that you never win an Oscar. It's a very short speech. You're going to have to shout, this is a dictatorship, and that's it. And then the next person says, and then he responds by saying, oh, I should just go to academia then, right? So you get I guess your 30 or 40 minutes in academia. So so the idea that I'm trying to point out here is that with almost uniform voice, the activists that I was seeing on Facebook who were part of my feed, they're comprised by about 150 students from private and public universities in Chile, are contextualizing this huge moment for Chile, which is its a kind of big moment in the getting the Oscar nod for this movie, by reminding people that what's happening now is actually a dictatorship, right? So that it's as bad as the dictatorship which most of them didn't live through, and most of them don't have a direct memory of. But it's kind of a strategic attempt to put people in a place, put the people that are reading this in a place where they're thinking about the repressive nature of the dictatorship, connecting it to the Concertación, which then held power after the dictatorship, and connect it to Piñera and the reforms that this student movement is asking for now. So another example, this is another student who goes to a private university, goes to a public university in Valparaiso, and he says, with the Oscar, with the winning of the Oscar No, the transition will end, right? So the idea being that if the No film wins the Oscar, then this transition period will be complete, right? We'll finally have fulfilled the legacy of post-dictatorship Chile and the transition from the dictatorship. And then they go on to discuss how it didn't win, and okay, so I guess it's the other way then. The transition is not being complete. And then this is a photo that's shared by a student leader who was the former president of a federation at a private university, and she's saying in this kind of mock-up that's been made by someone who runs the Universitario Informado page, they voted for no, so they voted for the No campaign, but they said yes. And so this is yet another critique of how the transition in Chile was just a continuation of the dictatorship. And this is the kind of drumbeat that students have been talking about for at least the last year in Chile, and how they're attempting to situate what is happening with education in Chile and the profit-making going on in Chile as just another in a line of problematic policies that the dictatorship produced. So it's part of this kind of long continuity that they're trying to hook people, both students as well as families of students, into. Now, it's not the only framing, but it's one of the ways that especially as the election is coming up, that they're trying to create a new space for talking about these issues outside of traditional electoral politics, which they have been doing for the last year and a half, but they see it as very important to maintain that, some of the students I should say, to maintain that as the elections are coming up in 2013. So a little bit of context behind that, that sort of moment in which this is happening in 2012. So the Chilean winter, as some of you know, that began in April of 2011, saw participatory democracy kind of flourish in universities and later in high schools in Chile. So these sorts of takeovers of university buildings were also coupled with massive, large-scale assemblies in which the grassroots bases were charged with making decisions about the way that student federations that represented some of these universities or some of these high schools would go. It also saw big kind of media events like the Besathon, which is like a kiss-a-thon for education and for people who are indebted by student debt in Chile. And it also saw media events that like this thriller kind of zombie walk that went from Chile all over the world on YouTube. So it was characterized by these kind of massive gatherings in public space. So researcher Manuel Castells talks about this as a necessary condition for the development of social movements, to have offline space, even though the online world has democratized in some ways networks of counterpowers, so people who can connect to others who can possibly frame issues in particular ways and change the values and interests of society. He also maintains that what's necessary for these movements to develop are these sorts of offline autonomous spaces in which people can gather and actually reinforce the practices, the democratic practices that they hope to see in society. And this is what, even though I wasn't there in 2011, when I was there in 2012, this is what students told me over and over again, that this habit of participatory democracy that they were enacting was something very different than the democracy, the representative democracy that exists in Chile, which they consider broken, but also something that, that they hadn't seen since 2006, when some of them participated in an earlier student movement around high school education, which was known as the Revolución Pingüina. So this key kind of, I think, thing to understand about this movement, which I'll characterize as a new social movement as well as coupled with kind of a traditional social movement, is that this is a space that was opened up in part by student federations, which throughout the 90s were troubled and had a hard time organizing in particular spaces. So this is kind of a new moment for the university federations in particular, which have regained some of that political position that they lost during the dictatorship, and have been organizing, at least over the last decade, through these new formations that are called sometimes colectivos or movimientos, which are kind of like nascent parties that exist within the university structure and help to structure some of the social movement framing across universities and across kind of social space in Chile. So there's a kind of complicated configuration of a variety of these, and I can talk about them more in the questions. But one of the things that I'll see over and over again through the online social networks is that offline social networks that are constructed in part by these colectivos and these kind of nascent parties help to structure the movement of discourse through the online social networks. So things are being shared between people who are part of these sorts of quasi-party structures, again, that mainly exist at the university, with the major exception of the the Communist Youth, which exists, of course, as a political party in Chile. So I'll skip over the kind of research in collaboration piece, but the idea here is that the interviews and observations I conducted, I tried to do in collaboration with students and with other participants of the movement. So I'm still bouncing ideas off of students in Chile as a way of formulating the way that I think about the movement and the possible successes of the movement. And most students are very open to the potential to have their movements criticized. The notions that that they're fighting an uphill battle to some extent, even though they are very hopeful about the possibility for change in Chile and the possibility for new democratic space to open up. And then I've continued observation on social media by observing Facebook pages and interactions on those Facebook pages, which I'm able to do till the present. So I think I've covered fairly well how the context was constructed in by students in the social movement of the political kind of the political elite structure. So what I think is important to understand here about the transition from democracy is that during the transition, the kind of convivencia, which is this attempt to create a new way of living in democracy and a new way of political life in Chile, the political elites favored a sort of closed elite negotiation system over the sorts of social mobilizations that we're seeing right now. So the 80s saw a rise in social mobilizations that helped put pressure on the Pinochet government as well as international pressure.
And so I'll just get right down to it. We're happy to have Jackson Foote here today. He's a PhD candidate in the School of Journalism and Mass Comm at UW-Madison. He's also a former recipient of last season's Tinker-Name Summer Research Program, or grant program, I should say. Today he's going to talk about Otro Chile Es Posible, media memory and framing political opportunity in the online networks of the Chilean student movement. So thanks for coming.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And thanks everyone for coming. Sorry that I'm running late. My introduction here is partially about
Happy Jackson arrived in one piece, and just take a deep breath. So, good afternoon. My name is Sarah Riff. I'm the Outreach Coordinator and Undergrad Advisor for the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program, and I'm very pleased to have you here today for our Lunchtime Lecture series. If this is your first time coming to our series and you're interested in kind of finding out our whole schedule of events, we do have a weekly listserv that we send an email blast out to of all of our events, and there's a clipboard over there in the corner that you can put your email address on.
About an experience that I was able to have in Santiago during my month that I was there in the field, in which I was invited to see the premiere of a new Chilean film that had come out about the dictatorship. So this film, as you may know, because it was nominated for an Academy Award, starred Gael Garcia Bernal, and he came in, of course, about 10 minutes late, and everyone was waiting for him. So I got a little bit of that experience this afternoon. I didn't mean to recreate it, but thanks for letting me do that. I'm also going to keep this hopefully to about 30 minutes so that there's time for questions. There's a lot of expertise in this room, and so I hope that there will be tons of questions and feedback. This is a work in progress and one that I've talked with some of you about, but hope to get a lot of new kind of impressions on this type of stuff. So I couldn't decide whether to include a question mark or not. Maybe that's one of the things that you guys can help me decide. I think the students that I worked with in Chile over the month and have continued to follow would emphatically say that it shouldn't have a question mark, that it's a declarative statement. Another Chile is possible. And I think it's an open question, and I'm looking at it kind of from three angles. from an angle of media, so how discourse and framing circulates within a new media context that includes online tools like Twitter and Facebook, which you'll see some of. Memory, both of the dictatorship or silence about the dictatorship, as well as the transition that began in 1990 and the post-transition or post-democratic presidencies of the Concertacion, the coalition that took over after Pinochet